Welcome you to our presentation tonight, Wild Cultivation, Traditional Plant Management Systems of Northwestern North America. With a very special guest, Nancy Turner, who I'm so pleased is here with us tonight. So again, I'm Sarah Colbert with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Hello to any returning webinar participants, and hello to all of those of you who are new. The Canadian Wildlife Federation, we've been around for 60 years now, helping people conserve wildlife populations and habitats, and help people discover and get inspired to support wildlife in their corner of the country. And an email, I did say earlier, an email will be going out after the webinar, and with some links for you, including a link for this recording. So before I hand this over to Nancy, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, and that I respect the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. And I find that ties in perfectly with not just this webinar tonight, but of course, even in general with the Gardening for Wildlife program, because the First Nations people for eons have been working with nature, respectfully taking only what they need, using everything fully, wisely, reverently. And I love that all of us in our own corner of this country are doing our best to respect the land, nurture the land, and do our best to appreciate it and support it. So that's nice. We can all come together in that light. So I think I've covered everything on this in terms of housekeeping. So I'm going to now hand it over to Nancy, our very special guest. Nancy is an ethnobotanist and distinguished professor emeritus at the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. Nancy has worked with First Nations elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern North America for over 50 years, helping to document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and environments, including Indigenous foods, materials, and Indigenous traditional medicines. She's authored, co-authored, and co-edited 30 books, and some of which I'll show at the end of this presentation on some slides, so you can get a sense of them, and over 150 book chapters and papers. Nancy has received a number of awards for her work, including membership in the Order of British Columbia and the Order of Canada, as well as honorary degrees from several Canadian universities. So Nancy, I am so incredibly grateful that you're here tonight to share some of those wonderful things that you've discovered along your journey with us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will mute myself and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really good to be with all of you this evening. And I'm going to start sharing my screen and see if I can do this. I'm not as very adept at this. And there we are. Okay. Yes, here it is just starting to get dark. It's just after 7 o'clock, and I know where Sarah is. It's just after 10 o'clock. And some of you may be in even later times than that. So thank you for joining me for this talk today. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I also want to express my appreciation and gratitude to the Nanaimo peoples, Salishan peoples of Vancouver Island and the Salish Sea, where I live on a small island off Nanaimo. And also to the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia across North America and worldwide, with thanks for caretaking of the Earth's lands and waters over so many generations. I want to thank Sarah and the Canadian Wildlife Federation, so many other friends and colleagues who have been, as I say, on this learning journey with me. Dr. Doug Doerr, Dr. Dana Povsky, Kim Rakamakludisi, my dear friend from the Qualicum Nation, Dr. Marianne Ignace, Dr. Nancy Mackin, Dr. Darcy Matthews, Drs. Trevor Lance and Natalie Ban, and people from the environmental studies area at the University of Victoria, and my husband, Bob, who I call my personal photographer, and so much more. Thank you for the important work that all of you do. And most especially, I am so grateful to all of my teachers and collaborators from the First Nations, mostly here in British Columbia, but others in other parts of the world as well. And these are just a few of the people who have shared information that I'm sharing with you this evening. And I'll just mention them by name because they mean a lot to me. Many of them have passed away now, but to me, they're still with me. Starting at the top left, Sam Mitchell from the Slatlimuk or Lillooet Nation, Quaxistalawatla, Clan Chief Adam Dick from the Kwakwakkwak Nation, Sawadena from Kingcome, Selena Tamoyakan from the Syilx Okanagan Nation, Satlama Joan Morris from the Songhees Nation in Victoria, Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwepemc Nation out in Salmon Arm, passed away some years ago now, and as did Dr. Margaret Sywallis from the Newhalk Nation, Cyril Carpenter from the Heiltsuk Nation, Dr. Lusjim Arvid Charlie from the Cowichan Nation. I just texted him today about our book, and he mentioned that his birthday is on Friday, so you can be thinking of him then. Annie York from the Ntlakatmuk Nation, Chief Ron Ignace from the Secwepemc Nation, Elsie Claxton from Saanich Nation, Dr. Umik Richard Atleo from the Nuu-chah-nulth Ahousaht First Nation, Chief Ernie Hill from the Gitgat Nation, my friend Pauline Waterfall from the Heiltsuk Nation, Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation, and finally, the beautiful Helen Clifton from the Gitgat Nation, who is, I believe, in her mid-90s now. A wonderful woman who's all of these people and many more have been my teachers over all the years that I've been working in this area. And I just thought I would mention the book, my most recent book, our most recent book with Dr. Lusjim Arvid Charlie of the Cowichan Nation, which just received a book award last Saturday. It was announced. And one of the plants that people have looked after, tended and cared for and enhanced its productivity is the sweetgrass. And many of you know what I call my very favorite book, Braiding Sweetgrass by my friend, Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer. I just thought I would also recognize her for the work that she's done. And we get together often for visits through Zoom. And down here at Esther Hans from the Newhalk Nation in Bella Coola, holding a handful of sweetgrass from the Bella Coola River estuary. So today I'll just give you a brief introduction to this area, tell you 3 quick stories to introduce this topic, talk about Indigenous environmental knowledge and traditional land and resource management systems, and give you a few examples, and then come to conclusions. I'll try and fit this into about 50 minutes or so to leave time for questions there at the end. So for the area that I'm talking about, say from central Alaska south to the Columbia and east to the Rocky Mountains, there are about 50 different major languages spoken within this area. And some of the peoples are related linguistically and culturally to each other, and others are quite distinctive. And for example, the Haida Nation, the Tanaha peoples, nobody knows, as far as I know, any other languages related to those two. So they are called linguistic isolates. People of this area rely heavily on their local plant resources, plant and animal species, fish and seafood on the coast, salmon even up into the interior, hunting of animals and birds of various kinds, and many different kinds of plant foods, from root vegetables and greens to fruits, the inner bark of trees, on the coast seaweed, and even in the interior because it's traded there, woods and fibers as materials, and many medicinal species. And to accompany all of the knowledge about these plants and animals are many stories and ceremonies and traditions that go along with how to use them respectfully and as Sarah mentioned, with great care, and how to look after them properly or care for them. And there's strong evidence of sharing the knowledge about plants and animals and environments across time and space. And my book called Ancient Pathways, which is a 2-volume book, really talks about how people shared knowledge across time and space. And here in this region, these 2 maps show the combined diversity, if you can think about putting them together. We have on the ones on the left, just the rough boundaries of people's traditional homelands and territories, just to show how many there are. And then on the right, the major vegetation zones, and within each of those, whether it's the coastal hemlock or the coastal Douglas fir or the montane zone or the interior plateaus, in each area there's many different habitats, whether they're river estuaries or wetlands or rocky slopes. And of course, each of these has its own distinctive complement of plants and animals. And if you read the anthropological literature, at least from some years ago, you see this term hunter-gatherers, and people in this area are often termed hunter-gatherers. And the implication is that they just simply went out and took what they could find from the land and used what they could pick and pluck in the way of plants. But I think from what I'm going to talk to you about this evening, you'll see that that is far from the case, and it's really an inadequate designation to call people hunter-gatherers in this area, at least. And these are some of the resources here: salmon berries and the springbank clover. I'll show you a little bit later. I have had some growing in my garden that I harvested just a few minutes ago. And so I'll show it to you. And of course, salmon, very important here on the coast and in the interior. So the story I'm going to tell you first is about Quaxistala Huatla, because he passed away in 2018, Clan Chief Adam Dick. And I worked with him for many years, and his partner, Kim Rakamakludasi. And he was talking here about the Tequila root gardens, that is the tidal marsh root gardens at the mouth of the Kingcome River, but there's similar root gardens at river estuaries all up and down the coast. And he was talking about the root vegetables, the plants that his people, when he was a boy and a young man, would harvest from that area, the Tequila root garden. It was all important, that tuxus, the springbank clover, the glicksam, the silverweed, quinine, the lupin, huquam, the rice root. It was all important, he said. And there is the Kingcome, and there's a mountain above the Kingcome Valley. And these are the roots he's talking about. So we have the huquam, the rice root, the quinine, the lupin, the taxus, the clover rhizomes, these white ones, and the glicksam, the silverweed. They were all important, he said. And he said, then he was talking about huquam. He said, yes, that was my job when he was a little boy, 8 or 9 years old, to pick them off. It's on the bottom, called the gogump. Then they told me to throw it back in the garden. It's like a cup, and the hukum sits in there. The hukum is the rice root itself. That was my job as a kid when I was with the old people. And he would go down by canoe with the elder women, his mother and grandmother and the other elders, to look after the root gardens. And he had this special job. And I wondered what that was, the gagump, because gagump actually means grandfather. And it wasn't until many years later when I got a chance to go to the Kingcome Valley with Quaxistala and with Okwalokwa, Kimrakamakludasi, and Doug Doer and other friends and students. And we went out with Adam to the Tequila root gardens, and there we saw these little sprouts. You can see them there. They're not quite the little rice-like grains, although those will also produce new plants. But these sprouts would be a little bit more mature, and they would take those off the bottom of the root or the bulb and put them back in the soil. So I had to ask it, what's this about? I thought. So Adam, is that gagump going to grow into a new plant? And he said, yes, that's why we did it. You dummy. No, he didn't say you dummy. But it was obvious. He was telling me about it, and I just had to confirm what was going on here because I'd never heard about anything like that before. And so after he showed me and after we talked about it, I realized, wow, this is something I'd never heard of people doing on the coast. And then the same year, I was up in the interior and I was working with and learning from Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwepemc Nation. And she was talking about her mother and her grandmother and going out with them up to the upper elevation areas to dig the roots or the bulb of the shwich, the yellow glacier lily, which was a staple root vegetable for her people. And she said, yes, we would help Grandma. She'd dig and turn the sod over with a digging stick, and we'd be right there. And we buried back the little ones. We took only the big ones. When you look at the root, she said, there's a little part on it. It's called the whiskers. And you had to clip that off and throw it back in the soil where it was growing so it would grow back again. Then she went on to say when they took all of the bulbs down to the camp and they were cleaning them, they made a little pile of those whiskers and they took them back up the next day and they planted them in the places where they'd been digging. So here we have two people in two very different places who didn't know each other, spoke different languages, one down in the coast, one up in the hills, one down in the water tidal marsh, doing essentially the same thing. And then some years later, I was up in Bella Bella, out with my friend, the late Cyril Carpenter, in his boat. And he started talking about how his grandmother told him about berry gardens that were up in Roscoe Inlet in Heiltsuk territory. And he said they used to pick a place that was like a terrace beside a waterfall where the berries grew, but they would also make them grow even more lush and more productive by burying the fish guts and clam shells and ashes from their campfire because it was near their salmon camp there. And they said, and they sometimes transplanted the berry bushes to those locales. And he said, she told him, you could just pull the berries off by the handful. And later I was talking to my friend Pauline Waterfall, and her grandmother and Cyril's grandmother were related to each other, and they both told them the same thing. They heard exactly the same account of these berry gardens where you could just pull the berries off by the handful. We went to look for it with Cyril's widow, my friend Jennifer Carpenter, and Harvey Humchett and his wife Brenda and a few others. We went to look for the berry gardens, and we think we found them. But of course, when their grandmothers were talking about them, it would have been about 80 years ago where they had these. So it was pretty much grown over by the time we were there. So those are the background stories, and that's those stories and other ones from Chris Paul and others started me thinking, no, these people are not just hunter-gatherers. They're doing something that we could call cultivation. And cultivation means to stimulate, to enhance, like you cultivate a friendship. You have to work at it. You can't just take it. And that takes us back to the whole system of knowledge that Indigenous peoples worldwide who have lived in one place for a long period of time have as a body of knowledge that they live by. And my friend Fikret Burkus has defined this as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations of cultural transmission. And if you're wondering what cultural transmission is, there are lots of ways to pass on knowledge. And one of the ones that's very common among Indigenous communities is actually just participating in whatever activity people are doing. So here we have my friend Helen Clifton down at their seaweed camp at Kiel on Princess Royal Island. And here she is with her little granddaughter, now grown up, Janelle. And they're pounding dried halibut together. And Helen has a yew-wood mallet, and Janelle has her own little mallet. And she's got her own little block, and Helen's got a big block. And Janelle's just having fun. She doesn't really, probably not even realizing that she's learning so much from her grandma, but just by doing it. And so that's one kind of cultural transmission that's very common, to have children with you when you're doing all of these different activities. And of course, people have being close to the land and spending time in many different places, observing all the animals and even the plants, they learn from other species. And so we see, for example, here's where a grizzly bear has dug up rice root. And what do you see in the bottom? Little tiny grains of the little bulblets from the rice root that are left in a freshly dug sort of bowl. And if you look at where I took this photo in the estuary of the Kitlope, you'll find little clumps of rice root growing beautifully and in areas where grizzlies have dug. And people can create the same kind of effect by digging out most of the roots and then replanting the gogump or leaving the little bulblets behind. And if you watch a bear eating berries, they never eat them all. Some of them are scattered around on the ground under the bush. And these ones are going to grow into new plants. And so a lot of people, when they pick berries, they'll do the same thing. They'll take a handful of the berries that they've picked and maybe throw them over their shoulder or throw them to some place where the berry bushes aren't growing as thickly. And that helps to continue the productivity. Or they might have watched a beaver, especially the people who use willow or other plants that produce long shoots. If you see where the beaver has cut off this willow tree, there's young shoots, multiple young shoots growing up just behind the cut. And these are the flexible withes that people could use for making fish nets or for making baskets. And so people would coppice, they would cut or prune the willow and other basket plants, the Saskatoon, the hazelnut, to make these withes, just the way the beaver has done. And as I mentioned, this knowledge system is embedded in beliefs and practices, and one of them goes back to an unpublished notes that I found when I was reading through the notes of ethnographer James Tate. My friend Wendy Wickwire has written a wonderful book about James Tate. If you're interested in him, he's an amazing man who lived with the Untitled people for many years. And he wrote in his notes for the Untitled, flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth sorry and weeps. It rains or is angry, makes rain, fog, and bad weather. So that just kind of, the underlying belief system is, don't take too much, don't pluck or use it, don't pull things out or destroy them unless you really, and just take a few, all of that. Look after what you need, because these plants are the covering or blanket of the earth. That seems so profound to me. And there are words in the languages, in all of these different languages, that have to do with looking after the plants and animals and tending them. And Aquatsistala Watla taught us a word that means keeping it living. And from that word, and I won't even try to pronounce it because I don't want to say it the wrong way, but it does mean, it translates as keeping it living. And that's the title of a book that my friend Doug Doerr and I edited about traditional management systems. And so we can think of the way people looked after the plants as perennial cultivation. It's different from growing annual plants like maize or wheat or even quinoa, because the plant resources that people use from this region are perennials, almost entirely perennials. And so you have to look after them in different ways, and we can call it perennial cultivation. Some of the strategies for keeping it living, I've already mentioned some of them. So partial harvesting or selective harvesting from trees and shrubs, and leaving them to live and regrow and resprout. Tilling or churning up the soil. Weeding, taking out some of the grasses or plants that are competing with the plants that you want to grow. Fertilizing, as I mentioned, with the berry gardens, or pruning and coppicing the berry bushes to make them grow and sprout and produce more fruit in the years to come. Replanting the propagules, as I mentioned, or transplanting them to new areas. The use of fire is very, very important. There's a whole book about that that's just been reprinted in a new edition, edited by Robert Boyd, Indians, Fire in the Land, it's called, from Corvallis, University of Oregon Press, Corvallis. Maybe it's Oregon State University Press. Altering the habitat, creating berms and creating terraces is another way that people looked after their plant resources. And people think that anyone could just go and help themselves, but that's not the case. There were very strong social strategies in place for people to be the caretakers or to tend the plants in a given area, or the animals or the fish. And you could say they were owners, but it's not ownership in the sense of the private property that we think of today in today's mainstream society, but rather it's having the responsibility to look after those resources and to make sure that they're there and they're not depleted for the coming generations. And multi-generational monitoring, so looking after a given area and watching it year after year, and then taking actions to make sure that those areas are kept up. So we have here, for example, partial harvesting. Here's an alder tree that had a piece of bark removed to be used for medicine or possibly for a red dye. But in any case, you can see that the tree is starting to grow over where the cut was made. People would never cut all the way around the trunk because that would kill the tree. And unless you need the entire tree for some reason, you wouldn't kill it. And the same with picking berries and picking greens. You selectively harvest some of the green stems and always leave some behind. So it goes to Mary Thomas as well. When she was talking about the shui, you remember, but she was also a wonderful basket maker. She made the most beautiful birch bark baskets, and she was an expert in birch and harvesting birch. And she was talking about the same thing. You have to be very careful that you don't cut through that thin pulp that covers the tree, or the sap will start to come out of it and you deprive the tree of the sap. Once the bark is taken off, it will turn into a hard surface that protects the tree and it keeps the tree alive. And you can see up in areas where people have harvested birch bark, the trees are still alive, and you can see where the birch bark has been taken off by the brown underlayer of bark, but the tree itself is still protected. And this goes not just for Secwepemc, but for all the different nations. For example, in 1921, Franz Boas, the ethnographer, talked about the same kind of philosophy. They do not take all of the cedar bark when they're harvesting cedar bark for baskets or mats. He said, for the people of the olden times said that if they should peel off all the cedar bark, the young cedar would die. Then another cedar tree nearby would curse the bark peeler so that he would also die. That's a pretty strong incentive not to harvest the whole tree. Therefore, the bark peelers never take all the bark off a young tree. They just take a strip and the tree will eventually survive. It will survive and it will eventually grow over that. And you can see it. If you go out up the coast or even into the interior, you can see evidence of this partial harvesting system in these culturally modified trees. For example, these two from the Gitga'at territory, and this one has been harvested, has had sheets of bark harvested from it on several occasions. It's a big old growth cedar tree and it's still living today. It's probably about 500 years old or more. Then I mentioned about fire, the use of fire and landscape burning. We're witnessing huge fires these days that sweep over vast tracts of land, up mountainsides and so forth. That's not the kind of fire that people had in the past. People were really expert at knowing when to burn and where to burn. There's a wonderful story that was told by Baptist Ritchie from the Lil'wat Nation called Burning Mountainsides for Better Crops, if you translate it from the Lil'wat into English. And a lot of our understanding about it goes to this story from Baptist Ritchie. But there are many kinds of berries and wild root vegetables that grow well after a burn, after an area has been burned and cleared a little bit and the shrubs and sort of burned back to leave more of a prairie or a meadow environment. And that's what people were doing. So for example, I want to give you just a few for instances. We're talking about root vegetables here, which includes roots and bulbs, tap roots, corms and rhizomes, all of them. And there are many different kinds that provided people with carbohydrates and other essential nutrients in their diets. They harvested huge quantities of some of these roots, for example, the camas, the two species of camas that we have on the coast and also in the southern interior around Castlegar, in the Sinife territory as well. And so we have, as I mentioned, plots of roots were owned or were under the proprietorship of individuals. It might be an elderly woman or it might be a clan chief, but it was their responsibility to look after those, to decide when it should be burned or when it should be cleared. The timing of harvest is important. They often would have first root ceremonies to celebrate the time when the roots were ready to harvest. And people would replant and transplant propagules. And rhizomes and roots and corms were also preserved and were widely traded from one area to another. And there are all kinds of stories and teachings that go with the use of these root vegetables. I mentioned the 2 species of camas, and this is actually a prairie that is on the University of Victoria campus that shows the extent of the camas that's growing here. And that's this cleared area. You can see where it gets bushy in the back. The camas is still there, but it doesn't really grow very much. We've done some work on camas and its density in different areas, and have found that people are in the past harvested several gunny sacks full, you could say, back in the day when my friend Chris Paul, back in the 1940s and 50s, when they were still harvesting the camas in huge quantities, putting them into burlap potato sacks. Once I counted the quantities that would be required to fill one of those sacks, and then the number of sacks that families would have used and the number of communities harvesting, and figured that people were actually harvesting on Vancouver Island about 10 million camas bulbs a year. And the camas prairies were maintained by fire and also by clearing rocks and so forth. Anthropologist Wayne Suttles worked with the Tsok Nation and others in Salishan territory, and he found that he talked to one woman who was responsible for burning the camas area that belonged to her grandmother. And they did that burning after they harvested the bulbs for the season. So the soil would be churned up and the fire would rush through. It would be in the summertime. And so the ash from the grasses and the stalks of the camas would fall into the cracks left from the digging of the camas and provide a shot of nutrients for the young bulbs that were left behind, because they just selected the largest ones and left the little ones to grow. And here's what happens if you really are cultivating the camas. This is from the work of Dr. Brenda Beckwith, who I just saw up in Nelson last week. And they have a seed company and are growing camas there in Nelson and in the Kootenays area. The digging stick, Yewood digging stick, is the ideal implement for prying up the camas bulbs and without cutting them or anything else. And she salvaged these bulbs from a highway clearing, and she planted them out and watched them grow for 5 years in these flats. And this is what she produced at the end of that time. Beautiful big bulbs. And our student, master's student Kate Proctor, did her field research on camas. And this is where we got some of the ideas of how the numerous quantities, the huge quantities of camas that people were digging. These are the bulbs found in 1 square meter plot in the Garry Oak Preserve that's looked after by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And these are arranged by size. So the little tiny ones are 1 year old, and these would be 2 year old and then 3 year old. By the time they get to 4 years old, they're starting to grow down. They drill down deeper. So the 5, 6, 7, 8 year old bulbs are down probably 6 or 8 inches or more. And those are the ones that people will harvest. they leave the little ones in the turf at the top. And when they're finished harvesting, they put the turf back. Then they give it a swift burn. And the little ones will eventually continue to grow and grow into the big ones. And they can come back in a few years and get more. As I mentioned, the digging stick is the perfect tool for this kind of digging, as well as for digging clams, but also for digging roots. They help to break up the soil and aerate the soil, and they create this disturbance that actually stimulates growth of the root vegetables. There are many different kinds of digging sticks. This one was made by Mary Thomas for me, and it's made of black hawthorn. This was made by Sam Mitchell for me, and it's a mule deer antler. And then these are ones from archaeological sites, and these are ones that Quaxistala and our students made out of yew wood. So we'll go back to the Kilak, the tidal marsh gardens, and as Quaxistala was saying, that's all important. See, when they go down the flats, they use little pegs. This is my area. You got your own pegs in the flats. You continue on that, digging the soft ground so it'll grow better every year. Well, I guess fertilizing, cultivating, I guess that's the word for it. I think he got it. Every family had pegs, owned their little plots in the flats, and they lined up their plots according to the mountain peaks and other points of land around the root gardens. So each family had their own plots there. And for each bulb, just like with the camas, there's multiple age groups of the bulbs. And so not only did they replant the gogump from the rice root, but also each of these little rice-like bulblets will grow into a new plant. And we found that by actually doing this. This was work of one of our master's students, Jen Pukonen, who worked with Richard Atleo and the Hausat Nation, looking at some of these cultivation techniques. Another root vegetable, this Wapato, or sometimes called arrowroot, with tubers, and is very important in the Lower Fraser, the Lower Columbia. There's a place called Wapato in Washington State named after this root vegetable. And Lusjim Arvid Charlie told me that their people from Cowichan used to go up and dig the Wapato in the Fraser estuary, but they also brought some back and transplanted it into lakes on some of the Gulf Islands and Vancouver Island. And here's from Wayne Settles again, the head of the Sturgeon Slough up the Fraser Valley. The Catesy families could establish seasonal claims to Wapato plots, and they would be cleared of growth so the Wapato tubers would grow more easily. And guess what they found when they were digging up pilings or making place for base of one of the bridges going over to Golden Ears? They found a whole patch of waterlogged Wapato rhizomes, tubers that turned out to be nearly 4,000 years old. A pure patch of Wapato, in Hulkameetnam. And they found with it digging stick tips. There they are, the edges of digging stick tips. And these are right by the Catesy historical campground going back to that time. So that was very exciting. And my friends, Natasha Lyons and Roma Leon and others wrote a paper about this, the Catesy and the Wapato, an archaeological love story. Just a very exciting. And Mary Thomas up in the Shuswap and Salmon Arm, she used to dig Wapato with her grandmothers, and they called it Kokolots too. So that name is related between the Hulkameetnam down in the Fraser and up in the Shuswap area. And here's Baptist Ritchie, the one who I told you about, who told the story originally in the Lillooet language, burning mountainsides for better crops. And this is how he starts. When it gets too bushy, then the ripe berries disappear and the roots, like the scamich, skimuta, squinquina, disappear. That is the scamich is the glacier lily. Skimuta is the tiger lily, and squinquina is the mountain potato. Then they burned. It was marked out, and there one did his own burning. When they used to burn that grass above the timberline, they used to say the Indian potatoes, that's the ones here shown, the spring beauty corns, were as big as your fist. Now they're only that big, like the size of little marbles, because they're not cultivated. My friends, Dorothy Kennedy and Randy Bouchard, taped Baptist Ritchie talking about this fire, burning, the use of fire. And I was up at the Hatlip Nation above Lillooet a few years back, just after there had been a fire the year before, and I couldn't believe it. The nodding onion, which usually grows to about 30 centimeters, was growing about a meter high and was in full flower. And that was just the effect of one quick burn in the Ponderosa Pine area there. When they used to burn that grass, oh yes, I said that. And now they're only marble sized. I guess that's a repeat of what I had already. And in the Tsilhqot'in area, the people there had a special ceremony that they recommended for women who had lost their husbands, who were still in grief and they couldn't get over their grief at being bereaved. They were told to go up on the mountain, the place where they call Potato Mountains, and pull up those mountain potato stems, the ones that are finished blooming and they're just starting to die back, and scatter them, throw them around in places where they're not growing. And that helps to spread the plants. So I was up there in the Potato Mountains with some of my Tsilhqot'in friends, and I found some of these stems. I put them in an envelope. I was going to do something with them. I'm not sure what, but they got into my notebook and I just had left them for a couple of weeks. When I opened the envelope, guess what I found? The stems were dried out and there were all these little black shiny seeds. And we planted them, and guess what? They sure enough grow into new potatoes. They grow into new plants. And so when you see this amazing field or meadow or prairie of the mountain potato, the Tsilhqot'in people say, that's not just by chance. We did that. That's our people working with the potato to make it spread over this whole area. And this was a staple root vegetable for them. And then I'll just quickly talk about berry production because we're running out of time perhaps. But there are many different berries, about 50 different kinds of berries, maybe 10 or more huckleberries and blueberries, and a number of species related to raspberry, like the black-cap raspberry here. There are 3 species of wild strawberries and elderberries and many other Saskatoons. And almost all of these will grow better after a quick burn, as long as it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't kill the roots of the plants, and they will sprout up again. So these are all really important species, and they're managed in a number of ways, not just through the use of fire or clearing, but you've probably noticed that berry bushes grow well along the edges of forest canopy or along the edge of a creek. They like to have a bit of sunlight and a bit of shade, and they like to have nice, rich soil. And so the best way to maintain the berry crops is to provide them with a patchy environment, like small scale burns and small scale clearing, as well as pruning and coppicing. That is cutting right back to the ground and having them sprout up again. And I've seen the results of this. What happens if you coppice a Saskatoon berry? In about 3 years, the branches will have grown up and they'll be covered with berries. And again, Quatsistala, Clanchi Fathom Dick. As soon as they pick all the berries, we pluck wheat, we break them so the berries will grow plentifully. See, a lot of people think we never touched the wild berries, but we did. We cultivated it. We pruned it, especially the guadams, the red huckleberries there. When they finished picking the guadams, you know, they pruned them. They break the tops off. And Sam Mitchell talked about the use of fire too. They would burn every 5 or 6 years. Now it's only timber grows because they didn't keep these clearings. They've become even age stands of timber, which are very vulnerable to major fires. It takes away from the other. They burned at Lillooet to make the raspberries, and west of Lillooet for the huckleberries. And Annie York, they wait until close to fall. They know just when to burn. Then 2 or 3 years after, lots of huckleberries, lots of blueberries, and the skemich. That's when it grows, when you burn. I've seen it. When the old people used to do it, I was just a little girl. I'd go up the mountain with Granny, and after we'd pick berries, my uncle would say, "It's going to rain pretty soon, time to burn." And they do it that way so that the fire is not going to spread. They watch the weather, they watch the tides, they watch the winds. The people who do that burning are experts in what they do. Everybody had their own berry patches, just like everyone had their own clam beds. Things like the salal, yeah, salmon berries and all that. All kinds of berries, wild crabapple. You don't just go out and pick. There's certain places a certain family goes, especially the wild crabapples. And so that's the ownership aspect. The land was cared for by specific clans or specific families, and over generations, the caretakership was handed down from one generation to the next. They put pegs around the crabapple trees so you know that they belong to a family. And then you have places everywhere that you could say are multi-resource management systems, because it's not just one thing that they're doing on the land, but you can see evidence for all of these different practices working together. And a great example of this is Hoyat, which is an ancient village site on North Hunter Island in Heiltsuk territory. And there's my friend Desiree Lawson standing in salmon, an area where there were stone fish traps and tidal fish traps that were used to monitor the salmon that were going up the river. And they're in this tidal marsh area, there are root gardens with clover and silverweed. There are crabapple trees that were carefully tended. We found culturally modified trees. And this was a major area supporting thousands of people at one time. There's a website about Hoyat, and I would recommend you look for it. This is more photos of the village. You can see huge bushes of berries, gooseberries, and crabapples. There's a cultivated cedar tree there. And there's stinging nettles. My friend Fiona Chambers, some of you might know her, found stinging nettles that hardly had any sting to them, but they were several meters tall. And these probably were planted there long ago by the ancestors to create the plants' fibers for making fishing nets. So the long and the short of it is, these people were not just hunter-gatherers. I think they got it wrong. And Mayanith, Dr. Daisy Seward Smith, says it better than I can. But see, people didn't believe that we did this. They think that nature just grows on its own. But our people felt to get more harvest and a bigger berry, they did these things. Same thing a farmer does. And this was back in 1996 when she was talking about this. Sorry. We'll go back because I wanted to just acknowledge Chief George Shaughnessy, as well as Mayanith, Dr. Daisy Seward Smith. And however, the colonists, the newcomers, were totally blind to these practices. They saw it only from European eyes. And you see this with Joseph Trutch, who was the Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works from 1865. I'm satisfied from my own observation that the claims of Indians over tracts of land on which they assume to exercise ownership, but of which they make no real use, operate very materially to prevent settlement and cultivation. And we have what happened to the First Nations lands everywhere across British Columbia and beyond. A lot of them were privatized, were taken over without permission. And we see here land that was taken from the Kingcome Valley, that the Hallidays, Mr. Halliday was related to the Indian agent for that region. And they had pigs and cows, and other settlers had those, and they came and took over a lot of those wonderful root gardens that Adam talked about. And I just wanted to wind up by saying that the practices that I've talked about are as important today as they ever were in the past. And despite all of the things that have happened to the First Nations across the country, people still have strong connections with their lands and with the plants and animals and fungi that they use. And there's still knowledge there. There's still the stories and the history. Some details have been forgotten. Landscape burning was banned and people didn't sort of forgot how to use it. But there are always a few people like Luce Cheam, like Helen Clifton, like Mayanith, like Quaxistala, who remembered, who learned from their early childhood, from their own grandparents and even great-grandparents about these things, and can pass on that knowledge. And with observation, careful experimenting, collaboration, sharing in an ethical way, and recognition of Indigenous peoples' knowledge and rights, much can be done to restore these practices and to bring back the productivity and the quality of these wonderful plants and animals that people have relied on for millennia. Thank you so much. I'll stop there and hopefully there'll be some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was really, really enlightening. And gosh, I loved seeing all of that. Thank you, and sharing all the different perspectives and the wisdom of these people. Fantastic. And I see that there are a couple of questions there, but before we get to them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen because it has a couple of the slides have, there we go. These are two of Nancy's books, the most recent ones, but don't worry about writing everything down because again, this is recorded. You'll get the link. You can look at them again after, as well as looking them up online. Some other wonderful books to explore. And then others, some older ones, but well, some of them are older, some of them are newer. Nancy's written so many books over the years. It's quite a wonderful resource. But I'm going to go back up to the most recent ones here. again, to see if you want to get a copy. And Nancy not only speaks beautifully, Nancy writes beautifully. So I highly recommend exploring her books. And now the questions are growing, so I better get to them while we have the time to do that. And it was so wonderful, everyone participating. I'm so glad that people have been able to join from across the country, even out here in Ontario, and staying up late for this. This is wonderful. So one question Kim has is, given populations of humans and overconsumption of the Earth's resources, can we return to these beautiful ideals? What are your thoughts on that, Nancy?
Oh, that's such a good question. And of course, things have changed. There's many more people, but we have to remember that that there was very dense populations of Indigenous peoples as well, and living in quite concentrated areas and still maintaining and sustaining the resources that they use. The thing is, using the regenerative capacity of plants and animals, but especially plants, perennial plants, you can maintain the productivity over a long period of time. And I think if I often go through cities and see all of the waste space that there is. If you stand on a hill looking over any city, you'll see that there's huge amount of space that's taken over in building roofs and in parking lots and in roads and in just kind of waste areas that are either paved over or just unproductive areas in cities, that with a little bit of care could be turned into food production areas or other kinds of natural areas to grow not only the plants, but to support bird life and other kinds of animal life, even within an urban environment. And if people maybe thought about reducing the amount of area that was into a green monoculture of lawns, and maybe turn some of that into wetlands, ponds, or berry bushes, or other kinds of diverse plant life that can not only be beautiful and provide beauty for your yard, but also can help to feed you. Those are the things that any of us can do, and I think that would be the place to start, as far as I'm concerned.
Great, thank you. And then Barbara has a question. You talk about the Nootka lupin. I remember Mary Thomas referred to the wild rose as Nootka rose. What does Nootka mean? Do you know?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Well, Nootka, you've probably heard of Nootka Sound, which is a place on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And in fact, the First Nations from that area were called Nootka. Before they renamed themselves Nuu-chah-nulth, because Nootka was kind of really focused in one particular area. And the reason why Nootka rose is called that is because the first person who described that rose was Archibald Menzies, who was a naturalist with Captain Vancouver in the late 1700s. They went to around the island and along the coast of British Columbia, and Menzies named and described a number of plants, and they have so he called it the Nootka rose, Rosa nookana, after that, and that's where that it's actually tied to that on the west coast. But the Nootka rose grows right up in.
Thank you. Great. Let's see. Marcy, I think I hope I pronounced it correctly, has asked, what is the best way to date and care for a forest garden of cultivated fruit trees? We are at Yarksis Reserve in Ahoosaht territory, and I've found a stand of crabapple, plum, and cherry trees that we think would be valuable to restore. My husband is from Ahoosaht, and I hope I said that correctly.
Ahoosaht, I think, but yeah, I know I've been to Ahoosaht, and of course, Umik Dr. Richard Atleo is a good friend, and would appreciate that question too. And indeed, there's crabapples around Ahousaht and in New Channel territory. And from what I understand from Kwatsi Stala and from Chief Ernie Hill from the Gitgat Nation and others and Mayanuth, crabapple trees can be treated in a similar way to an orchard apple in that you can prune them back and they will grow up again. And so if you find a patch of crabapples, I'd say maybe try a little bit of experimenting. And don't prune them all back, but maybe select some of the trees and prune them back, and then see what happens in a couple of years, whether they will resprout, produce more crabapples, but you have the other back on in case your experiment didn't work well. But I'd be happy to also share information about crabapples a little bit more deeply. There's been some really major and amazing work on crabapples that's come out in the last few years. My former student, Victoria Wiley de Echeverria, worked with the Gitgat Elders and did her master's thesis about the crabapples, molochs, they call them there, in that area, including the tending of them and how to look after the patches and so forth. So I'd be happy to share that reference.
That would be wonderful, because for those of you that didn't hear at the beginning of this webinar, in a few days, there'll be a Zoom follow-up email sent out once I've managed to create it, and we'll include whatever links I think could be helpful. And that would be wonderful. If you've got a link there to share, then that would be very helpful. And some of you are asking about the video replay. Yeah, so I'll have the link in the email that you'll get from Zoom. So make sure you check your junk folder, your spam folder, and then you can access that as well. Let's see, any more questions that need to be answered? Oh, here we go. Anna's asking, is there a certificate one can do in ethnobotany? Not a full degree, but to learn more about this.
Oh, thank you for that question. My answer is there must be, but I'm not specifically aware of a certificate program. But maybe try the UBC Botanical Garden, or depending where you are, sometimes botanical gardens would have programs in ethnobotany, and maybe the Montreal Botanical Garden, and sometimes the extension divisions of universities like the University of Victoria or UBC might put on programs like that. And I've heard of ones in the past, but I can't think of any right offhand that are happening in the near future. But I know they do happen on occasion.
Great, well, thank you. So there's just a couple more, I think, here. Jason's asking, in the interior of BC, we see a lot of our forests are clear cut, then replanted with conifers, sprayed with herbicides, and fires are excluded. How can we convince our forestry companies and our government that these lands have values and that these native plants, if recultivated, could help feed us in the future? So any thoughts on that?
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more.
It's a tough one, but
I'm a member of the Ecoforestry Institute Society, and we are a group of people who are looking at the practice of sustainable selective harvesting of trees rather than clear cuts. We have the stewardship of a property at Yellow Point on Vancouver Island, Wildwood, that had been logged selectively by Merv Wilkinson for decades, and yet it still has old growth trees, and it still has the diversity of wood and forests. And so there are examples, and every different vegetation zone has its own particular forest structure and forest requirements, but there are very few forests that are single species, single age stands that might happen in small patches with small fires, but what's happened now is, as you've said, the clear cutting and then replanting with trees that are often genetically similar leads to this extensive even age stand that is so vulnerable to insect infestations like the pine beetle, mountain pine beetle, or spruce budworm or whatever. And then the trees are killed, and then they're vulnerable to really hot, bad, extensive fires. And my dad was an entomologist, actually, and who predicted the mountain pine beetle infestation 50 years ago because he could see what they were doing. And I don't know how to, all we can do is just keep writing, trying to show people a better way of doing it, to not try and get so much immediate profit, but spread the benefits of the forest over a period of time.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And then I think this is the last question, then we're going to wrap up. This guy's asking, are there any Indigenous teachers on Vancouver Island who run workshops or share knowledge in this realm? I know of J.B. Williams and Della Rice Sylvester.
Oh, yes.
But I'm wanting to learn from more teachers and value this knowledge. So any thoughts there?
Yes. Well, there are a number in the Cowichan Nation, and Wildwood now has a program where we're working with several knowledge holders, including Uncle George Seymour and Lucia Marvid Charlie, who's getting on, but he and his family have also been teachers. Lee Joseph, who has done her master's with us and is working on her PhD from the Squamish Nation. She's not on Vancouver Island, but she does teach occasionally at UVic. And Cheryl Bryce from the Songhees Lekwungen Nation has also done workshops. I've worked with JB and Williams and others. Let me think. I could name a bunch of others, and maybe I could send you a few other names. But,
you can send me names if you want, and I can put it in the email, and then that can perhaps be done.
Two others, Geraldine Manson from Snuneymuxw and Kim Rakamakludacy from Qualicum. These are very busy people, but they're also amazing teachers. And so if you're lucky enough to be able to get into a workshop or a lecture that they might provide, that would be wonderful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And people are, writing in saying thank you so much for your sharing your knowledge and all that you've been doing. And I wish to thank you myself. I thank you everyone for participating. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on tonight and doing this for us. It's much appreciated. And yeah, we look forward to having this follow-up email to you guys. But in the meantime, definitely, big thanks to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It was a real pleasure.
Great. Well, and I learned a lot for sure. And I love the whole angle of medicinal and edible wild plants in a very respectful manner. And that's why I was extra happy to hear this from you. So thank you. So I'm going to wrap up, everybody, and have a good night, and look out for the email coming your way soon. And take care. And thank you again, Nancy, so much.
Thanks all of you for being here.
Great. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.